Hello, and welcome to an Infinity the Game battle report. In this report, we're covering one game from a recent event I attended where I played Nomads. Nomads are something that I've played against a lot on this channel, and we actually had some questions in some recent videos. How do I play when I'm playing as Nomads? So this video is kind of intended to answer that, or at least provide an approach that I tend to take when I'm playing Nomads. I'm going to show both lists that I took to the event, but this will just be one game. In this event, we had 3 scenarios. It was a one-day event. We were playing Capture and Protect, Frostbite, and Decapitation. And I got to play 2 of those 3 games because I tend to give myself buys, prioritize them when I'm running an event. So I played Capture and Protect against a Spiral player. It was a relatively new player. I'm not doing a recording for this game in particular because he had a fairly proxy-heavy army, but also because it was just a bit of a teaching game. But then in the final round, I played against Morats, which was a very interesting game. So that's what we're covering today. So this is the first of 2 lists that I took, and it's not the list I'll be playing for this game, but it is kind of a showcase of how I like to think about Nomads and how I like to lean into certain strengths that they have. The thing to note about both this list and the list that I played in the game that we're going to see is that it has no Morats in it. And that's kind of heresy, but also kind of the point that I want to make with this video. Morats are a unit that I think are very good, but are also kind of oversold. If you look at like high-performing Nomad lists or lists that sort of see a lot of consistent play in things like the online global leagues, you kind of see an average number of Morats per list of 2. Like they're taking maximum availability all the time, basically forever. And that's something that I think Nomad players, like we kind of want to critically analyze. Any piece that costs 17 points and half in SWC, or therefore in a pair costs 1 SWC and 34 points, should not be considered an auto-include. That's more than 10% of your list in 2 models, and there are times and places where Morats maybe aren't appropriate, but more importantly, you're locking up a lot of your lists in those points, and you're constraining what you can do with the rest of your list. When you start freeing up those points and those SWC, you get interesting opportunities that you can take that make your list a little different, that take you a little bit off meta, that let you just flex in some specific ways that maybe you couldn't do if you're really locking yourself into tag, 2 Morats, a certain hacking loadout. Like it's very easy to get very stratified, and that makes you predictable. Now, are those lists powerful? Yes, but I think this is too. So just as a bit of a showcase, this list is running kind of like standard Nomad good stuff, but it's leaning into Nomad 0 SWC gunfighting in addition to all of that. So we've got Jazz and Billy and then the new Zoe and Pywell who have been standout performers. And something to note about that pairing with the new Pywell is that although you lose Morats, you make up for it with pitches. There are 2 pitches in this list plus baggage off of the Salute, which means that if you need to, you can absolutely extend the hacking network. You've got your Puppet Masters with Puppet Bots, a Vostok, again we've got the Evo down there, 2 Moderators, 1 Transductor Zone, the Libertos, which I love, and the Libertos is part of why I will sometimes not take Morats. Because between your hackers and the Libertos, which I think is a fantastic piece, and the Morats, you start locking up sometimes more than half of your list's SWC, and that really locks you out of certain options, even with the 0 SWC Nomad gunfighting. So just sort of when you dispense with that, you can sort of see, what have we got here? Well, we fit a Salamander. So the gunfighting this list has access to is you've got your Ballistic Skill Attack Shock, AP Marksman Rifle Puppet Bot, you've got your Salamander for long range, you've got your Vostok, and you can put support wear on those remotes. There's a ton that's going on, in addition to, you can actually make some fairly direct forward observer attacks with this list. Putting marksmanship on either Pywell or the forward observer Puppet Bot gives you a very effective, high likelihood of success marksmanship attack, which, you know, as a back pocket 24-inch range band weapon option is really strong. Finally, there are 3 Morlocks in this list, and this is something that I've been using recently and I'm really happy with, is I've finally settled on Assault Pistol Morlocks as my preferred Morlocks. Now, EM-CCW Morlocks I think are probably the most, I would say, on-meta Morlock, because EM-CCWs are really, really good, and in particular it gives you an avatar solve. I am giving that up in this list, and I think it's possible that maybe one of these Morlocks should be an EM-CCW, but what I have consistently found is that Morlocks don't have stealth. It is very hard to get them into close combat, but it's very easy to get them within 8 inches. There are lots of circumstances also where you can just take impetuous activations and fire the assault pistol. Even at like 16 inches, is going to be often 4 dice on 8s. against someone with a combi rifle firing back on 1 dice, I have gotten a lot of kills, like a lot more value out of Morlocks as assault pistol gunfighters than I ever did trying to get them into close combat. That assault pistol has been the secret sauce and has allowed them to consistently value trade in like every game I've tried them with. You'll see that in the second list that I play as well. So this is list 2, and it's built for Decapitation and Frostbite. Now this started off as a little bit of a meme, but I'm actually really happy with how it played. What this list is built around is getting the maximum possible number of wounds into a list, which kind of just coincidentally makes it really good in those scenarios. So hey, we've still got Jazz and Billy, and then we've got an Interventor Lieutenant. I like an Interventor Lieutenant for Decapitation in particular, because there's no point just taking a Moderator. I want something that can potentially spend the LT order. Yes, I could take an NCO. I actually do have a Gator in this list, but I was able to save enough points to fit everything else that I wanted by having the Gator not be an NCO. And the Interventor is very comfortable spending those lieutenant orders. So it's sort of like not leaving money on the table, and in Decapitation, the Interventor can enter a marker state, etc., etc. Interventor lieutenants are really good. You do have to be careful with them, but I like it in this list. This is also what I would call like minimum viable hacking. I've got 3 deployment zone repeaters, 2 good quality hackers, and that's it. That's all I'm trying to do in terms of hacking with this list. There is a Vertigo Zone to make use of Spotlight AROs, but that's it. It's not a high spend, it's not a high investment, and by making those sacrifices, I still get myself a tag. I've got myself the 3 Morlocks in this list as before, but what we have is this chunky as hell core. Not core length, but like a core of models. So there's Puppet Master with 2 Forward Observer remotes. Now, this is distinct from the last list where I had 2 points to upgrade one of them to a marksman rifle, but I actually think I prefer just the 2 forward observers. The shotgun puppet bots are by far the most dangerous when you close with them, and if I didn't like explicitly have 2 points spare and not wanted to play a motorized bounty hunter right now until motorbikes change back to being able to not be impetuous, I would probably have just taken the 2 shotguns in that list as well. But in this list, just absolutely love them as a close assault force. And then we have 2 diggers and 1 gecko. Now, the diggers began as like, okay, this is kind of a concession to Frostbite as a scenario, but how many wounds can I actually fit in a Nomad list? And depending on how you count things like Dogged and the Mine Layer, like the presence of a mine on the board, does that represent, you know, something your opponent has to push through? This list has like 29.5 wounds, which even Toha can struggle to get that much onto the field. Now, the Puppet Master obviously is a point of vulnerability. If it dies, it only takes 1 wound to shut down 5, and for that reason I actually don't have an Uber 4 Commando in this list. But the Diggers are another piece I think is kind of oversold. In some places online, Diggers are considered to be like massively overtuned, and I don't think they are. I don't think any close assault non-stealth heavy infantry can be overtuned. They're so easy to stop. Like anyone who's had Achilles killed by a digger has both gotten unlucky and screwed up. But they are still valuable defensive elements. Sometimes they can high roll, and they fit the purpose of this list really, really well. The Gecko finally rounds that out. The Gecko is honestly pretty cheap for the amount of durability that it brings. And in terms of that wound count I mentioned, I actually count the Gecko kind of as 4 wounds. Because when it goes down to unconscious, I'm not going to try and recover it. I'm going to crawl that little gremlin inside out and start making burst 5 assault pistol shots. I like the Gecko. It doesn't always perform in every game, but for 56 points, it doesn't have to. There's plenty of like chuffed around it. So this list was really fun to play. I've played this a couple of times, but in this particular game, all the pieces lined up really nicely. So, as noted, heading into round 3 of the event, I've played 1 game, I've won it, I've had a bye just so the player numbers were even, don't really score that, so I'm on 1 win, whatever. And we go into round 3 and it's Decapitation. And I could feasibly have played either of these lists into Decapitation. This list sort of is built for it a little bit more, but it really would depend on the matchup, and ultimately the matchup was against Morats. And against Morats, where actually it's harder to slow them down with hacking AROs, I really liked the idea of having those Diggers and the Gecko as ablative wounds to stall out attacks. I also had a Whip 15 Lieutenant, which would help. I wanted to go first to Decapitation. Higher Whip value is nice, although I lost the roll against the inevitable Whip 14 Lieutenant, and my opponent snap picked first. So, here's the table. Now, this photo was actually taken sort of partway through the first round, so there's a light spoiler in the bottom left corner, but we're just going to kind of push on. You can see the decompression zones are mostly scattered on my opponent's side of the table. He didn't much want sort of to deal with them. This one here is actually an Eclipse Smoke Grenade, and we'll get to that in a moment. But my opponent is going first and has held back 2 reserves using his Strategos ability on Kornak. Now, this deployment I want to actually unpack in a fair amount of depth, because there are a lot of things that kind of happened here and some good practice that I think really, really saved me in this game. So the first thing to note is what my opponent has deployed. There are 2 Dartok cyber bullies back in this corner over here. Kornak himself is knocked in there with a paramedic. There are not currently in the initial stage of deployment any models on this rooftop. This is a fairly telegraphed core, and in particular, both of the Dartoks are here, right? So that's going to be important to remember. I'm just going to circle that, 2 Dartoks. Kind of in this mid-space, we've got some Datarazi. Tritak Anya is up there, and then there's some Datarazi on ground level, up probable but not certain Haris. And then there's a big Preta and Garki core with an Osnat hanging out here. So, what can we say? Firstly, no reserves. No SWC has been spent, which means that the SWC is all in reserve. Secondly, this is telegraphed as a real bum rush. Like, this is a straight line move up and over this high ground into my deployment zone, which means I've got a big threat coming this way, and I've got a big threat potentially coming this way. And finally, although I didn't notice this at the time, when you count my opponent's models and reserves, he has 14 troops. Now, I actually asked the question, how many things can I see, assuming 2 reserves? And my opponent said, I'm pretty sure he said 13, or he said 14. And in my head, I was like, oh yes, that's the right number. I don't have to worry about a Rassiat. Even though he explicitly gave me that information, it just hit the wrong connection somewhere in my brain, and I thought, no Rassiat, cool. Now, despite that, I deployed in a way that mostly protected me from the Rassiat, which is a really big deal. So let's talk about my deployment here. Firstly, I've assumed that there's going to be a big core link in kind of this space here, and I have totally avoided it. There's one Flash Pulse remote over here. There are some like Morlocks and some puppets hanging out in this area, but there is nothing for them to shoot. The Puppet Master, which is the one mistake that I've made this deployment, is hanging out in this nook back here. And we'll get to why that is a mistake, but it's Rassiat flavored. But then otherwise, we've got Jazz on these stairs here. You can't quite see it, but down there is my missile bot. Now, this is defending against Rassiat's 101, and I did it purely out of force of habit. Put a remote, or anything that's not Silhouette 4, right? Anything that's Silhouette 3 or less, in a safe position, hugging the back table edge. What that means is that as long as you're not Silhouette 4, which makes your base too wide, your back arc is too big, you can't walk a Rassiat or any piece onto the back table edge without having line of fire, which means that you get, in this case, I would have gotten a missile shot, worst case on 9s, which, you know, I might just miss, but that's scary enough that my opponent didn't want to risk it. Also really important, and if we think back to the guided missile video that I did, here are my opponent's pitches and, importantly, killer hackers. Now, there's no guided missile in my opponent's list, but I have a hacker lieutenant. I have vulnerable hackers. In my opponent's situation, would 100% have been willing to throw pitches forward and make Trinity killer hacker attacks against my hackers, which is why Jazz is back here, almost on the back table edge, and you can't even see it, but my interventor is off there. Like literally as far as possible as can be from my opponent's pitches, which are the biggest threat. This is the maximal possible amount of distance that I can put between these two pieces. There is a saturation zone. There's also difficult terrain in the way. I am as safe as it is possible to be with my lieutenant. Now, that does mean my lieutenant is threatened by this big attack that's coming in this direction, but I am basically otherwise protected. Now, we've got the otherwise. So we've established, right, I've defended myself by kind of refusing the flank, which means that I am open to this absolute YOLO charge. So how do we defend against the Gakis and the Predators swarming up and over into my deployment zone along a straight line? Firstly, we've got the Libertos here. The Libertos itself is furthest forward. This is Decapitation, so I can deploy the 24-inch line because I've got 16-inch DZs. If any of these things move, I can actually reveal it to take a shot or place a mine, and then the mine itself is further back. Then we've got these two diggers on the 16-inch line. Both are prone. Both, I think, have rolled up +1 armor, something like that. They are standing ready as ablative elements. And then finally we have the Gator itself watching like all of this space, and then the Gecko as well watching kind of this space. So tags on Overwatch are something you should try and do, but have to be careful with. We have overlapping fields of fire. Like we have a lot of guns lined up watching that area. But importantly, each of them is positioned where, so one, I can't get cross-map shot. This Gecko is positioned so that basically the furthest it can see is kind of out to here. So it cannot see this high ground where I suspect that big guns are going to drop down. And then, yeah, the Gator is going to land in the same place. Now, the Gator is actually my reserve drop. The Gecko is more conservatively deployed, right? It can't see my opponent's DZ, but then my opponent's reserves come down, and it is a Yalgat Sniper and a Suryat HRL MSV1. Big guns, core link formed, Harry's formed, second. I think actually got a Harry's, like Harry's core of the Gribblies. So the Gator comes down, and there we go. So we've got big overlapping fields of fire and multiple ablative wounds defending against the Warband attack. And I'm defending against the core link hacker threat by just literally being as far away from it as possible with just shitters in the way, basically. If they want to run forward, they'll be fighting, firstly, Morlocks, and secondly, puppets. Now, I mentioned there was one mistake in my deployment, and it was the Puppet Master. I had assumed there was no Rassiat because I'd gotten a number wrong in my head. The Puppet Master should have been probably up on this rooftop. It wasn't, it was over here, which meant that the very first thing that happened was that my opponent walked a Rassiat on, which sucked. That's a shame. It walked on here. Now, I've got a little bit of Overwatch down into this gap from some, like, there's a puppet bot, basically, that can see down through here. So the Rassiat moves and throws some smoke, and then moves, and fortunately, it's a boarding shotgun Rassiat, and it basically just comes around a corner, kind of as spoiled in the thumbnail, and that's a shotgun versus a Puppet Master, should be in cover. That is my Puppet Master, by the way. She's sitting there remote controlling her puppets on the little tablet. The only thing I can do, right, he's going to template me if I shoot, but I would rather make the trade. So I fire an AP round with a submachine gun, and he lays 2 templates down, because if he gets this kill, it's 46 points off the table. And the puppets are like scary points. I don't see my armor rolls, she goes straight to dead, but she hits on a 14, and with an armor-piercing round, she punches through the Rassiat's armor and renders the Rassiat unconscious. That's not a fantastic trade. My opponent has spent 3 orders, traded up on points, killed one of my most dangerous attack pieces, but it could be worse. The Rassiat being dead is a pretty big deal. Now, if it had lived, it wasn't in a position to do that much more damage, like it could maybe have run out through the smoke and traded with a Morlock or something. I'm not too concerned, but I'll take the trade. The rest of my opponent's first turn is this attack, and we can see here there's a couple of Morlocks as well that I didn't mention before. We've got Morlock in Group 2, Morlock in Group 1, both prone as like final lines of defense, and then here you can see my Interventor, like literally up against the table edge. My opponent just slams through, and like all of the rest of the orders of my opponent's turn are spent on the Datarazis and Anyat, and the 5 orders being generated by that Gaki, Preta, Osnat core, which means that there's something like 10 orders worth of attacking between the 2 of them having the Rassiat, or maybe more, maybe like 12 orders worth of attacking, slamming through this. If you want to envisage how this played out, basically imagine something like a scene from Zulu, or something to that effect, where there's just like firepower, maybe the like, imagine StarCraft with the Zerg and, like, you know, Terrans firing out of bunkers, was kind of how this felt. Very, very aggressive straight line movement. This whole core team is like, you can't kill all of us. They come up and through, the Datarazi come up and through as well, and it's just aggression on aggression on aggression. What this meant was I was able to take a lot of gunshot AROs as this link team moved forward. Now, this is actually something you can do with certain close combat cores, where you can just push literally 5 models forward on the grounds that your opponent can't possibly ARO all of them. I don't hate it as an approach, but in this case there was too much firepower. In one of these orders, my opponent was exposed to 3 gunshots. Now, one of them was just a Libertos shotgun, but the other 2 were high-quality rounds from tags. I missed one, but I hit another, and the firepower basically added up. This core kind of pushed forward, they got some smoke down, but they got shredded on the way through. They made it to about here before the digger, chain rifle, and grenade started coming into play. Yes, they cleared the Libertos, they cleared the mine, but that's as far as they got. This final gap, this terminal approach here before they could start getting up and around into my lieutenant was too much. There was too much firepower coming down. So what my opponent did at that point was he changed gears and began to move his Datarazzi Harries forward. Now he could have alternated these kind of activations. He probably should have. I think the end result would have been kind of similar, but he might have done a little more damage. So this, or more specifically, actually, I think he would have done the same amount of damage, but he would have ended up with more assets intact. He'd have had some Garkis and some Predators survive to be annoying on my turn. So Anya and Datarazzi move around this way. They get some smoke support up, and what she's trying to do is she's trying to come around here to get a 16-inch range K1 combi rifle engagement with these two tags. Now that's pretty smart. That's a really good gun for that purpose, but it's just not quite anywhere because of this. Like, this is not really cover for her. Too many of these face-to-face rolls are going to be in a position where she just kind of can't connect consistently without being out of cover. So what happens is there's a bunch of face-to-face rolls. Datarazzi do really well. Diggers and Datarazzi are like trading wounds, which does fortunately favor the diggers. Datarazzi just heavy pistols this turret to death. And that's one of the things I love linked Datarazzi, because it turns out they also still have BS-11 heavy pistols with mimetism. So one of Datarazzi just slides out and deletes this thing. Just face-to-face rolls it casually, like 3 dice 11s versus 3 dice 7s, no problem. But she gets into position, and at this point the diggers start dodging, and that's a pain. Like, there's too many models that my opponent has kind of in this space that are being subjected to templates that can hit multiple of them. He's getting arrows that are forked. He does eventually take a face-to-face roll with Anyat and this Gecko, and I don't think she wounds it, but it fails its roll, its courage roll, and it moves this direction because geckos don't have courage, but that's fine. And then she eventually gets into a face-to-face roll with the Gator, and I think after one roll, I've done enough. Basically, I've absorbed enough, and I guts this way as well. And those are actually quite important movements. So one of the things that's really important when you're deploying tags, and which I've done here, is that you leave them guts movement avenues, because there are plenty of guns in the game that can destroy a tag, even though a tag is a good ARO piece. It's got really high armor and a big gun, right? Tags are good at AROing, but they're also big pieces to risk. So always leave lines to guts. So in this case, this Gecko, depending on what we're shooting it, could have gutsed either this direction or this direction, and have been able to safely leave line of fire. And then this Gator, if it got engaged from this direction, which was most likely, it could guts this way. So in this case, I was able to make sure both of my tags stayed safe. And yeah, the damage just added up. My opponent hit all of these. Like, this is defense in depth, right? He had to push through the Libertos, through 2 diggers, and through 2 tags before he would even have gotten to these Morlock AROs. And there's a hacking network here as well, not that that will do particularly much. And ultimately, he did a lot of damage, but he stalled. He stalled out, and he took, I think, both, in terms of lost in ARO, he ended up losing the Datarazzi, both of them, Anyat, I crit her, and most of the Osnat team. I think, in fact, all of the Garkis and the Predators. And he killed the Libertos and the turret, and he wounded, I think, definitely he wounded the Gator, and he wounded both diggers. He didn't kill anything other than the Libertos. And that's part of the purpose of these ablative wounds, right? One of the reasons to take diggers, I don't think they're an every list option, but in this case they were really useful because they could take a wound, right? And they were trading chain rifles with Datarazzis. I'd fail one of my 2 saves, my opponent would fail his. Cool, I've traded up that way. And so the defense held. And that basically was the first reactive turn, but it more or less decided the game. My opponent, the casualties my opponent had taken were far, far higher than the casualties that I had taken. I'd lost effectively my Puppet Master, my Libertos, and a bunch of wounds, but only 2 actual models. And, well, 2 models, which meant that the puppets were down, but my opponent had lost functionally the entire Garki Predator Corps minus the Osnat, and a 3-man Haris and a Rassian. So that is a bloody nose to receive on the defense, and then it was my turn. So just jumping back to this tabletop state here, this broader tabletop, what I decided I was going to do was, Cornac and the paramedic are sitting in this building here, along with the 2 Dartoks, but pretty much all of my opponent's remaining strength is in this place. What they do have is really good overwatch angles. They've moved around a little bit with like 1 remaining order, but this is a firebase. I can't push in on this. Particularly, he's got the close range angles locked down, right? So I don't have any terrain that lets me move through these decompression zones. So any like Morlocks and stuff that try and make a run, in addition to just hitting heavy infantry, are going to hit the decompression zones first. They're going to stall. I'm going to take shots in ARO. It's going to be bad. What we do is we do impetuous with these Morlocks, and they'll eventually just run up this direction, and they just start taking assault pistol shots and stuff. Over the course of the game, they will eventually assault pistol the Osnat to death, and the other one will assault pistol one of the 2 HVT. So there's a HVT of my opponent's just down here. But otherwise, the rest of this turn is about the Gecko. So Jazz is able to like just crawl out, come up here, and she pots a pitcher down there, and then she gets straight back into cover. I use some coordinated orders to do some movement. And then the Gecko sort of comes down here, squeezes down the stairs, then pops off of them, and then begins moving up in this direction. Then it moves up there, it's tall enough to vault to there, and then it comes to this ladder. And then it comes up here, and then I use white noise. So this is the position that the Gecko reaches. And if we look at this, we can see my opponent's turret is here, the Suryat HRL is there, the Yargat sniper is there, and then the rest of the link is kind of like in this space. And a white noise pops down here, which means that none of those MSV guns can see me. So I have total carte blanche. So every remaining order in this group just about is spent on the Gecko moving up to this position here, and I can fire shots through this doorway, and my first shot is into Cornac. Now he's firing 2 dice on 14s back to me, I'm firing 4 dice on 13s at him. I win the face-to-face roll decisively, and I kill him, which is massive. And then I get a bead on the turret, and I kill it. And I think I get a shot at the paramedic, but it dodges out of the way. That's kind of all I've got steam left for. But I've just killed Cornac, which means... Oh, also I get to kill... Sorry, there's a HVT down here. I can kill it as well. And I can do that with impunity, because I'm in white noise, thanks to this repeater that you can see that's been placed down there. So these guns just can't shoot me. So I take those kills, and then I think I take like 1 face-to-face roll with a Yaugat. Maybe I think it takes like 2 or 3 rolls, because I haven't stripped 6 cents from the link, so it's firing back. It's firing back through a saturation zone, so I'm going to be 3 dice, sorry. 3 dice on 13s versus 1 dice on 15s, and it takes a fair bit of doing. Yaugat like just wins the face-to-face roll a few times, the double action round sprang, but I've actually put it unconscious. I'm using armor-piercing rounds because it's high armor, and then we pull back. And that's my turn, but I haven't lost anything, and I've killed Cornac. Now it's Decapitation, and he's playing Morats. There's no loss of lieutenant happening there, but killing Cornac knocks 3 orders out of the pool. And he's lost so much in his first active turn that what he has left is basically 4 troopers comprising that core. So he moves up and around, he sort of does a bit of link reforming, and what he's intending to do is to reform elements to try and rebuild some strength. And the paramedic attempts to pop back the Yaugat. And I actually can't remember if it succeeds or fails. I think it succeeds, but the order count that it takes to do all of this is just slightly too low, and he gets caught kind of out in the open. So we can see in this photo here, this is where like my pieces have ended up. I've used some coordinate orders to stage elements. Things have moved forward. You know, this is a Morlock here, for example. This is, I think, Digger has moved up to there. There's a lot of dodging that happened in my reactive turn. And my opponents moved these pieces out to here, and that's kind of where they've had to end. I can't remember if he recovers the Yaugat, but even if he has, he's way, way behind the 8 ball. So on my turn, I kind of just repeat the process. And here you can see the same deal, that picture is still there. So the Gecko, white noise just comes back up. I use my lieutenant order for it this time, and the Gecko just moves up, and these are savage face-to-face rolls, right? That's a Dartok there, that's the paramedic, that's the Yaugat. That's the Suryat here, Dartok here, Yaugat here, paramedic there. But because I've popped down white noise again, his big guns don't have the first shots. So I just pick off the paramedic, I pick off the Dartok. And at that point, 6 cents is gone, and I just kill the rest of his army. He's got 1 Dartok that's left hanging out in here, But last order of my, I kill his remaining HVT, I pop the Gecko into Suppressive Fire, and at that point he runs the Dartok out, tries to take a face-to-face roll, and dies. And that's it, it's been tabled. So this is punishing victory. Maximum points to Nomads. A real showcase of that like kind of wound spam. And also I am really happy, apart from obviously forgetting about the existence of the Rassiat and just my opponent telling me that I could see 14 troops and me being like, aha, yes, that's the maximum amount. I don't even know what happened there. Good practice and good defensive setup really 100% saved this game. You look at the casualty. Now, my opponent could have executed his first turn attack a little better, but the casualties that he took on the first turn set the tempo for the entire game. I'm very happy with how I played this. I think it was a really good showcase of this kind of defense. And also, if you think about it, if I had swapped out a bunch of elements for Masai Morans, I would have been in a much worse spot in this scenario. Because things like Gakis, linked Gakis that move easily up the field, just shred. They just eat Morans on rooftops. And then what do I have to cut to get that into a list? Well, I have to cut, at minimum, those 2 diggers. Maybe thin down the tag presence. Maybe I can't afford the Gecko because I don't have the SWC. So the imposts that having 2 Morans in my list would have made, particularly given I don't even particularly want to have, like, if there's a Moran in the list, my opponent potentially, with his tin-botted Killer Hacker link, just runs into the repeater area and risks face-to-face rolls. Might genuinely do that because I can't isolate his Dartoks. So they just blow out, they just ignore the Interventor for an order, blow out Jazz, and then switch their attention to the Interventor. Now that's not an ideal situation. You don't usually want to stage dive an Interventor's repeater network because the BTS is so high, but they do have plus damage Trinity, and they can also just Oblivion her. It would have been, I am very happy in this particular map, like this is a use case, right? In this particular case, I think I was saved by both the list composition, the decision not to include fragile skirmishing elements like Masai Morans, and instead just have lots of robust, chunky wounds and armor and toughness. And I fought a very solid Morat list on its own terms. I matched the strong elements of my defense up in the places that they needed to go. And yeah, just was a really interesting, really fun game. Hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for more, maybe a little while until my next one, but we are preparing for, we're starting to play ITS Thunderclap season games. If there's anything that anyone is interested in seeing or hearing about, or in particular, if there are any tactics videos people would like, topics that people would like covered, I'm happy to do those as well. Just suggest a topic and I'll see if I can put together a video about it, if there's a contribution I think I can make that's useful. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you next time.